There's a moment a lot of people have had recently. You're in a conversation with a younger colleague, a sibling, maybe your own child, and something they say stops you completely. Not because it's wrong, not because it's naive, but because it's coming from a place you don't fully recognize. A set of assumptions about the world, about work, about identity and loyalty, and what a good life is supposed to look like that feels genuinely foreign to you. And your first instinct might be to call it entitlement, or hypersensitivity, or the inevitable consequence of too much screen time and not enough hardship. But something about that explanation never quite lands, because when you actually pay attention, when you sit with what they're saying instead of immediately categorizing it, you start to notice something else underneath, a kind of clarity, a refusal to pretend, an almost unsettling willingness to look directly at things that previous generations learned to look away from. Gen Z doesn't think the way you think, and the reason why goes much deeper than phones and social media and avocado toast's even younger sibling. It goes all the way down to what they experienced during the years when the human brain is most open, most plastic, most permanently shaped by the world it finds itself in. This video is about what actually happened to this generation psychologically, and what it means for all of us. If that framing already feels different from what you usually hear about Gen Z, stay with me. And if this channel is new to you, hit subscribe. We break down the psychology behind the things most people never examine carefully enough. Drop a comment below too. I read every single one. Because what I'm about to walk you through isn't a defense of Gen Z or an attack on them. It's something more useful than either of those things. It's an explanation. And once you have it, the way this generation moves through the world stops being baffling and starts making complete, almost inevitable sense. Here's what nobody tells you about Gen Z. Their defining psychological feature isn't sensitivity. It isn't entitlement. Psychologists call it post-traumatic clarity, a shift in values and priorities that happens in populations who have experienced significant collective disruption during their formative years. It's the same phenomenon documented in generations that came of age during wars, economic collapses, and periods of rapid social upheaval. The world revealed itself to be unstable and unsafe at exactly the moment their brains were deciding what to trust. And they responded the only way a healthy nervous system can. They stopped pretending it wasn't. Gen Z were children during the 2008 financial crisis. They watched their parents lose jobs, homes, and retirement savings, while institutions confidently explained that everything would be fine. They came of age during a global pandemic that shut the world down during what should have been the most socially formative years of their lives. They inherited a climate crisis, a mental health epidemic, and a political landscape that seemed to produce more heat than light, regardless of which direction it turned. And they processed all of it in real time, publicly, on platforms that never let anything disappear. That isn't a recipe for entitlement. That is a recipe for a generation that simply cannot afford to be naive. The research on this is striking when you look at it directly. Studies from the American Psychological Association have consistently shown that Gen Z reports the highest levels of stress and anxiety of any generation currently alive. Higher than millennials, higher than Gen X, higher than baby boomers at comparable ages. But here's the finding that changes the entire picture. They are also the most likely generation to recognize that stress, name it accurately, and seek help for it. In previous generations, struggle was something you buried. You got on with it. You didn't talk about it, because talking about it meant admitting it, and admitting it meant weakness. And weakness was something the world punished swiftly and without much sympathy. Gen Z dismantled that logic almost entirely. Not because they are weaker than previous generations, but because they grew up with enough information to understand that burying pain doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it heavier. That shift from suppression to acknowledgement is not softness. It is one of the most psychologically sophisticated moves a generation has ever made. and it is costing them socially in ways that say far more about the cultures judging them than about the generation being judged. Here's where it goes deeper than mental health statistics. Gen Z are the first generation to have grown up entirely inside the attention economy. Not just with access to the internet, the way millennials did, but immersed in it from early childhood. Algorithmically sorted, constantly measured, persistently aware that their thoughts and appearances and opinions existed as content to be evaluated by an audience they couldn't fully see. What does that do to a developing mind? Psychologists studying digital identity formation have found that growing up in that environment produces a specific cognitive pattern: a heightened ability to detect inauthenticity, a deep discomfort with performative behavior, and a strong preference for directness over social niceties that feel hollow. Gen Z developed an almost automatic filter for anything that feels manufactured. They can smell a corporate talking point from 100 miles away. They will call out a contradiction between stated values and actual behavior faster than any generation before them. This is why they seem so difficult to manage in traditional workplace structures. It is why they respond so poorly to authority that relies on hierarchy rather than competence. It is why they ask why in situations where previous generations simply nodded and complied. They are not being difficult. They are being precise. Their entire developmental environment trained them to question surfaces and look for what's actually underneath. And here is what that means in practice, the part most people miss entirely. Gen Z's psychological profile produces a kind of thinking that is simultaneously its greatest strength and its most misunderstood quality. They are remarkably good at systems thinking, at seeing how things connect, how structures produce outcomes, how the personal and the political are always already entangled. They are unusually willing to sit with moral complexity without needing it resolved into a simple answer. They are genuinely fluent in the language of emotional experience in a way that previous generations simply were not equipped to be. These are not soft skills. These are precisely the cognitive tools that the problems of this century are actually going to require. The ability to hold complexity, the refusal to accept comfortable fictions, the insistence on alignment between values and action. That's not a generation that needs to toughen up. That is a generation that arrived pre-adapted to a world that everyone else is still trying to catch up to. So here is what the psychology of Gen Z actually tells us. They think differently because they had to. Because the world they were handed was not the stable, legible, trustworthy place that previous generations were at least allowed to believe in for a while. They never got that window. They came in with their eyes already open. You're not looking at a broken generation. You're not looking at a spoiled one. You are looking at a group of people who were shaped by more disruption, more information, and more collective grief than any previous generation had to absorb at their age, and who responded by developing a set of psychological tools that are honest, sophisticated, and genuinely necessary. The question worth sitting with isn't what's wrong with Gen Z. It's what they might already understand about navigating an uncertain world that the rest of us are only beginning to learn. Tell me, does this match what you've noticed about this generation, or your own experience inside it? Drop it in the comments. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of depth coming. And if you want to keep going, the next video breaks down the psychology of people who grew up feeling like they never quite belonged anywhere, and why that feeling is far more telling than most people realize.